Welcome to the second ADAP Clinical Quality Management tutorial. Today, we're going to be discussing quality improvement tools. As you can see from our learning objectives, we are going to discuss data in a little bit more detail, talk about which QI tools you can use, specifically focusing on run charts, control charts, fishbone diagrams, and then giving you an idea of how to prioritize your improvement ideas. W. Edwards Deming was one of the very early leaders in the field of quality management. Dr. Deming wanted to turn quality management not just into an art, but into a science. And one of the things he stressed is data. Data being the key to improvement, the key to understanding what's happening in your environment and figuring out how to make it better. Sometimes we talk about drilling down your data. What we're really talking about is looking a little bit below the surface of your data and understanding what's going on at a deeper level. For instance, if you have a program that has a 90% recertification rate, there's 10% there that are not being recertified. But who are those people? Is it predominantly male? Is it predominantly female? Is it predominantly in a certain age bracket? That's what drilling down determines. But of what benefit is that? Drilling down your data helps you identify barriers. As I said before, it helps you look below the surface of what the numbers are showing you. It'll also help you identify areas for improvement. And really, that's what this is all about. It encourages involvement from all team members. And it also helps to improve your overall care. The more you understand your data, the more you know what's going on below the surface, the better your patient care will be. Let's look at some steps in drilling down your ADAP data. First, you want to develop a list of clients who did not meet a measure. It's always helpful to do to get a better understanding. You then want to look at it by age, race, location. Look for the things that you find pertinent that continuously come to light in your program. You want to display your data through different visualizations. That really is incorporating the right QI tool for what you're doing. Visualizing data makes it a lot more understandable for people, for key stakeholders, to be involved in your improvement efforts. Then look at why the folks that you've identified didn't meet the measure. What are their barriers? Who are they? What demographic do they represent? And most importantly, use QI tools to set your priorities for improvement. The benefits to this can't be understated. You'll best be able to serve those most in need by tailoring your activities. Let's just say that you have an issue with males between the ages of 45 and 55 being recertified. Programming to meet their needs is going to look very different than programming you would use for women 30 to 35. If you do this, you'll be more likely to achieve improvement. You'll be able to target your resources more wisely for sure. And you'll have better relationships with your clients by meeting their needs. So overall, that improves the engagement and care. So we talk about a QI tool, but what really... Now let's look at some tools to use with your data. Collecting data may seem very easy, but it's really not. You have to be very careful in what you're collecting. You have to collect it the same way each time you do an observation, and different people have to collect the data in the same way they do observations. So training is involved. One simple thing to use is a checklist. It is a standardized instrument that makes it much easier for any individual to record observations while you're going through tests of your data. We've put this example surgical safety checklist in here just to give you an idea of sometimes the complexity of these, but also of its usefulness. This is a step-by-step procedure to avoid infection, to help a surgeon and the surgical team think through all the steps necessary to treat the patient. Checklists don't have to be this complicated, but this gives you an idea that they are an essential instrument and that they can be complicated and be very helpful. The first rule in displaying your data is to know your audience. You need to know to whom you're presenting this and what their level of interest is, where they fit into the whole scheme of your improvement effort. The second rule, know that your audience has a short attention span. People typically linger on PowerPoint slides for 5 to 7 seconds. So telling them the story in the shortest possible time is key to helping them understand what's going on. And if there is a third rule, it's to consider the first two rules over and over again. The table below gives you some data broken down by race and sex. It seems fairly simple, but think about the amount of time that you have to linger on that table. And then let's look at the data presented in a different way. This data is the same data that you saw in the table before. What it gives you is a little clearer picture of categories by ethnicity and also categories by sex. It's a helpful graph and a helpful presentation so that someone can see in a very short period of time exactly what your patient population looks like. As a hypothetical exercise, we're going to track the percentage of ADAP enrollees who were reviewed for continued ADAP eligibility 2 times in the measurement year over the last 2 years. So we'll track that number, we'll log it on a monthly basis, we'll look at it on the next slide, and think about what you're seeing and record your observations. In this case, just take a moment to look at the slide, linger on it, and mentally note how helpful this may or may not be to you. Here's our data tracked over time. This is basically a 2-year period, and you can see how the data fluctuates. Keep this graph in mind because we're going to use it again in a couple of different examples. Basically, you can see that at the starting point, you're at 67, and at the end point, you're at 82. So that shows some significant improvement. One of the ways that a run chart is very helpful is that it enables you to see trends over time. It will also show you developing problems. If you keep up this run chart, you'll start to see if your data is trending downward or upward over time, and you can react to it quickly. You can also add a level of complexity to these run charts. I mentioned before about trending up or down. You can add a trend line. This data would probably show a trend line moving upward, maybe in a gradual slope, but nonetheless moving upward. You can plot the average over time or the mean, and you can set upper and lower limits for performance. I'll talk about upper and lower limits for performance in a minute, but basically what you can do, even from a non-statistical standpoint, is set lines on the chart that when something starts to dip below, it triggers immediate action. Another way to look at this data is in something called a histogram. A histogram is a little bit different in that it doesn't use individual observations, but it takes those observations and groups them into common themes. These themes are called bins. Keep in mind that the interval in the bins must be the same. And if you look at the example on the chart, you'll see what we mean. Histograms are definitely used for one variable. Otherwise, it would just become too confused and you really wouldn't be able to see anything that's going on. They can also be constructed in a number of ways, but most people use frequency. So if bin X has 5 members and bin Y has 9 members, bin Y is obviously larger than bin X. The height of the bars usually determine the frequency, but the widths don't change. The widths are fixed. This is what a histogram looks like visually. I've taken the data from the run chart, grouped it into bins. So if you look at the biggest bin on the right side, it says 100 underneath it. Really what that means is 76 to 100. So any data value that fell between 76 and 100 goes in that bin, and that's the frequency. The frequency in this case of all those numbers is 15. Same can be said for the 75 and the 50 bin. This tells you where you have the most number of observations over a given time period. That's useful information. So let's talk a little bit more about the bins. They're usually expressed as the top limit of a range of numbers. If you remember from our histogram, one of the bins said 100. That meant 76 to 100. If you also look on the left side, you'll notice there was nothing between 0 and 25, and only one observation between 26 and 50. You always have to have equal intervals for your bins. Again, these data observations will all about the one variable viral suppression. Histograms can also be useful in spotting deviations in data. If your expected outcomes for your ADAP, re-registrations, whatever, don't look like your actual outcomes, that's a flag. That means there's some opportunity there to improve, or at least an opportunity to investigate further. Now we're going to talk a little bit about process mapping and move away from actual data analysis per se. Your process is still data, but in a very different way. Think of it as doing a map for someone and telling them how to get to your residence or to your office. You'll tell them what streets to turn on, you'll tell them where to turn, how to turn, you'll tell them how long they should drive in a certain direction. That's a flow. You can think of the same way as if you're going to make a pizza. There are a lot of quality improvement activities and exercises. One of the most fun ones you can do with a team is step-by-step instructions on making a pizza. And you'll be absolutely amazed at how detailed it can be. Thankfully, flowcharts use some very common industry-accepted symbols. Imagine if they didn't, you would never be able to understand one process from another. This is an example of a process. You can see that there's a starting point, there's some data involved, and then from the data there's decisions to be made. And depending upon what those decisions are, it may involve another process, or it may move on to something else. The little red or reddish A is a connector. It means it starts on one page and continues on the next page. In this case, there's more data involved. It seems pretty much like a duplicate of what was on the first page. Let's see why. Now here's a real-world example. You can see blood drawn, the results are the data that we saw. Then a decision, is the patient anemic? If yes, then treat for anemia. If no, continue on the next page. We do more tests. Then we want to see if the patient's taking aspirin. If the patient's not taking aspirin, we refer out and close the case. If they are, we discharge the aspirin. So it seems that this patient might have had a problem with excessive bleeding. Something as simple as that. And you can see how every step of the way, a clinician could look at this and know what to do, or vice versa, a clinician can map this out for future reference and to show how he treated the patient. We've talked a bit about tools, we've talked a bit about data, we've talked about how to analyze your data. It can be very overwhelming when presented with a lot of information and then not knowing what to do from there. Next, we're going to talk about collecting ideas and setting priorities. One of the ways that you can involve a lot of key stakeholders or just your entire staff in quality improvement is to get them involved in the entire process. And that involves listening to and soliciting their ideas, making them feel valued, and making them feel part of the team. A brainstorm exercise is one of the ways you can do this. It is meant to solicit ideas from all stakeholders. One of the caveats is that it must be run by a skilled facilitator. It has the potential, with everybody in a room, to sort of go off the rails pretty quickly. One thing that the skilled facilitator must be consciously aware of every time is that every idea is welcome and no idea is judged. There is no room in the audience for someone saying, "Oh yeah, Jim, we tried that idea 2 years ago and it was a failure." That stops the entire conversation dead in its tracks, and you might as well restart the brainstorm another day. You have to record every idea. Piece of paper, log it on a computer. It's got to be visible when all the ideas are given. There must be a list so that people can see everything. And it's very important to stay focused on the topic. The other thing, and the most important thing, is when you do record these ideas, you then are probably going to have to group them into like items. The importance of that is that many people will say somewhat the same thing, but not using the same words. If you group them in terms of like items and get consensus from everyone, everyone needs to vote on that, and everyone needs to have a voice. Voting is very important. There's a couple of different ways you can do it. Some use something called the fist of five, where for any given idea, a person has up to 5 fingers to vote on that idea. The nice thing about it is that in a long list, you can really prioritize what the audience feels about each idea. Once that's done, you will have a list of prioritized items. Your list of prioritized items is wonderful. Everybody had a chance to contribute their ideas. Everybody reached consensus on what the most important ideas are. And you may have 5 or 7 that make a lot of sense and that everybody is very excited about doing. The problem with that is that not every idea is so easy to implement, and not every idea will have an impact. There's really no easy way to determine improvement priorities considering those two things, the ease of implementation and impact. But one of the things that can help you is something called a priority matrix. Priority matrix takes those things into account and helps you determine where you want to proceed. This is the priority matrix. As you can see, over on the left, on the y-axis, it looks at impact. It goes from low to high. And on the x-axis, it looks at ease of implementation, from not easy to very easy. The red star in the upper right-hand corner is where ideally you will spend a lot of your time, that it will be easy to implement and have a high impact. Not every idea will. Sometimes you're going to have to do some of the harder ones where it'll have a high impact, but it won't be so easy to implement. It just depends on your resources, on the time you have to do something, and the urgency of it. And again, there's no set formula for determining that. That is a decision you will all have to come to, and it's also a management decision. Just some tips and tricks for using the priority matrix. Sticky notes are almost mandatory because you will find you will be moving things around. It may be very tempting to do the low-hanging fruits, but they may not deliver the greatest benefit to your clients. Remember what I said before, consensus is very important. The matrix is a great tool for organizing your ideas. It is a lean tool. It's been used for decades, and people have found it very successful. So let's summarize for a minute. Data is the key to any improvement effort. You really can't fix something if you don't know it's broken. You really can't make something better if you don't know how it's behaving in the first place. Data will take a perception and move it into reality. A lot of times in organizations, there's a perception that something's not working well, or maybe it is, or vice versa. Visually displaying your data is a really important way to communicate your progress. It's a way to communicate your message and a way to communicate why you want to work on the things you're working on. It's important that people understand that and that buy into it, because everyone should be involved in quality improvement in an organization. The few tools we went over are just some of the many tools that are available for a number of different purposes. If you look to the websites that are listed on this slide, those are just 3 of the many websites available that not only have tools, but other helpful information to help you in your quality improvement efforts. You can also search on the web for information on a specific tool if you've heard of it, or just Google something by topic. We hope you found this useful, and on behalf of NASDAD and the Center for Quality Improvement and Innovation, I thank you for listening.